January 12, 1945. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The winter sun hung low over the pine forests as a convoy of trucks rumbled through the camp gates, carrying 47 recently captured soldiers from the German armed forces during the war. Among them sat Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, a 28-year-old officer from Munich who had spent 3 years believing his side's propaganda about American racial divisions being the nation's fatal weakness. He watched through the canvas opening as American soldiers of different backgrounds moved about the camp, and a slight smile crossed his face. Everything he had been told was about to be confirmed before his very eyes. What Friedrich could not possibly imagine was that within 6 months, one of those very soldiers he initially dismissed would save his life, shatter every assumption he had carried across the Atlantic, and transform him into one of the most vocal advocates for human dignity in post-war Germany. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true account of how a single act of unexpected courage during America's most segregated era would bridge an impossible divide and prove that humanity could triumph over the deepest ideological conditioning. The processing line moved slowly that afternoon. Private James Washington stood at his assigned station, methodically recording prisoner information with the same careful precision he brought to every task. At 24 years old, he had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where he had learned early that excellence was not optional, it was survival. His handwriting was impeccable, his uniform pressed to perfection, his posture military straight. He had joined the army in 1942, believing that service to his country might earn the respect that skin color denied him at home. Friedrich watched Private Washington work, noting the separation between the processing stations. The white American soldiers occupied one set of tables, while soldiers of color staffed another section. The German officer's education had taught him to interpret such arrangements as proof of inferior status. He turned to his fellow prisoner, Feldwebel Hans Schneider, and spoke quietly in German. Then Friedrich said, "See how they organize their own people? They put on a show of unity. But the truth reveals itself in every detail." Hans nodded, but something in his expression suggested less certainty. He had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg before the conflict, a man who had always questioned rather than accepted. The exhaustion of capture, the long voyage across the ocean, and the growing awareness that everything he had been told about the inevitable victory might be false. All of this had begun to crack his faith in the teachings he had absorbed. Hans had seen things during the final months of fighting that troubled him deeply. The promises of miracle weapons that never materialized, the assurances of imminent victory, even as territory was lost daily, the increasing desperation of commanders who had once seemed invincible. Every certainty he had held was eroding. Private Washington looked up from his paperwork and met Friedrich's eyes. The German officer did not look away, did not adjust his expression. He simply maintained that subtle smile, that knowing look. Washington had seen that expression countless times in his life. He recognized it instantly, but his face remained neutral, professional. He asked for Friedrich's name, rank, and unit in clear, practiced German. The Oberleutnant responded with barely concealed amusement, enunciating each word slowly as if speaking to a child. Then Friedrich said, "You speak the language well for someone in your position." Quite impressive. Private Washington's pencil did not pause. He recorded the information exactly, checked the spelling, and moved to the next question. His composure was absolute. Years of navigating hostility had taught him that reaction was weakness, that the greatest power lay in refusing to be provoked. He had learned this lesson in schoolrooms, where teachers expected him to fail, in restaurants where service was denied, in 1,000 small encounters that tested his dignity daily. But Sergeant Marcus Cole, standing nearby, had heard the exchange. At 31, Cole was one of the few non-commissioned officers of color in the camp, a distinction he had earned through 8 years of flawless service and a patience that sometimes exhausted him. He stepped closer to Washington's station, his presence a quiet statement of support and authority. Then Cole said, "Is there a problem here, Private?" Washington shook his head slightly. "No problem," Sergeant Cole said quietly, continuing his processing without missing a beat. Cole held Friedrich's gaze for a long moment, The German officer saw something there he had not expected, a depth of experience, a weariness that came from battles having nothing to do with the conflict overseas. This was a man who had fought for respect every day of his service, who had proven himself repeatedly, only to face the same doubts again and again. Yet there was no defeat in his eyes, only a steady determination that Friedrich found himself respecting despite his prejudices. Then Cole turned away, making a note on his clipboard. The prisoners were led to their assigned barracks, buildings that had been constructed specifically for housing captured soldiers. Friedrich examined everything with keen attention, his military training making him automatically assess the facilities. The barracks were clean, well-maintained, far superior to anything he had seen in the final chaotic months before his capture. There were beds with actual mattresses, blankets that looked new, windows with glass that was not broken. The contrast with the conditions he had left behind was startling. In those final weeks, his unit had sheltered in bombed-out buildings, scrounged for food, and watched their equipment deteriorate from lack of replacement parts. That evening, the prisoners received their first meal in American captivity. Friedrich joined the line with his fellow Germans, expecting meager rations, perhaps poor quality food. The rumors among German forces had always described American soldiers as soft, dependent on luxury, unable to function without excessive comfort. If this was true, surely prisoners would receive only basic sustenance. Instead, servers loaded his metal tray with portions that seemed impossibly generous. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and coffee that actually smelled like coffee rather than the grain substitutes he had grown accustomed to. Friedrich stared at the tray, unable to reconcile this abundance with everything he had been taught about American weakness and scarcity. He sat at one of the long tables, examining the meal. Around him, other prisoners were eating with barely restrained hunger, some with tears in their eyes. Several men ate too quickly and had to stop, their stomachs no longer accustomed to such richness. Friedrich forced himself to eat slowly, maintaining dignity. But the food was better than anything he had tasted in 2 years. The chicken was properly seasoned and cooked through. The potatoes were real potatoes, not the sawdust-mixed substitutes that had become common back home. The bread was soft and fresh, the butter real dairy fat rather than industrial replacements. More than that, he noticed that the American soldiers, both white and of color, appeared to receive similar meals. The portions might vary slightly, but the fundamental quality seemed the same. This contradicted everything he had been told about American society, hoarding resources for certain groups while denying others. Hans sat across from him, eating with more obvious appreciation. Then Hans said, "Friedrich, this food, this place, nothing is as we were told. Remember what the officers said? That Americans were starving, that their production was propaganda, that their society was collapsing from internal divisions. But look at this meal. Look at these facilities. This is not a nation on the verge of collapse." Friedrich leaned forward, keeping his voice low. Then Friedrich said, "Of course they feed us well, Hans. We are prisoners protected by international agreements. But watch how they treat their own. The divisions are still there. You cannot hide the truth of a society's structure. The food means nothing. It is simply compliance with rules." Hans did not look convinced, but he returned to his meal in silence. Around them, other prisoners were having similar conversations in hushed tones. The abundance was undeniable, but its implications were too disturbing to fully accept. To admit that American resources were this deep would be to admit that resistance had been futile, that the promises of victory had been lies. Over the following days, Friedrich made a point of observing the camp's operations. His analytical mind, trained in military logistics, naturally catalogued patterns. He noted that the segregated units often worked separately, that the facilities for soldiers of color were in a different section of the camp, that the social separation was maintained even in a prisoner of war camp, far from combat. This confirmed his expectations, validated his understanding of American weakness, but he also noticed things that did not fit his expectations. He saw Sergeant Cole directing both white soldiers and those of color with equal authority. His orders followed without question or hesitation. He observed training exercises where units of different backgrounds coordinated with professional efficiency, their movements precise and practiced. He watched as medical staff, regardless of color, treated wounded or sick prisoners with the same careful attention, the same dedication to preserving life. Most troubling to his worldview, he noticed Private Washington everywhere, always competent, always precise, often explaining camp procedures to new arrivals in perfect German. The young soldier had somehow become an unofficial translator. His language skills apparently valued enough to give him responsibilities beyond the typical private's duties. Friedrich watched him translate medical instructions, explain work assignments, and facilitate communication between confused prisoners and camp administrators. Every interaction demonstrated competence that should not exist, according to everything Friedrich had been taught. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into their captivity, a transport of new prisoners arrived. These men were in far worse condition than Friedrich's group had been. They had been captured during a particularly difficult operation in the Rhineland, held in temporary facilities near the front lines, and transported through multiple stations before reaching Louisiana. They were exhausted, some injured, all desperate for information about their fate. Many showed signs of malnutrition, their uniforms hanging loose on gaunt frames. Several had injuries that had not been properly treated, makeshift bandages now dirty and inadequate. Private Washington was assigned to process this new group. Friedrich watched from a distance as Washington moved through the line with practiced efficiency, speaking calmly to each frightened soldier, explaining what would happen next, assuring them that they would be treated according to international law. One young prisoner, barely 19, was shaking with fear and fever. His eyes were unfocused, his breathing labored. Washington paused his paperwork, called for medical assistance, and stayed with the boy until the camp physician arrived. The doctor, a white captain named Richardson, examined the young prisoner quickly, his hands moving with practiced competence. Then Richardson said, "Pneumonia, possibly. We need to get him to the infirmary immediately. How long has he been like this?" Private Washington translated the question to the boy's companions, received their stammered reply, and relayed the information. Then Washington said, "They say 4 days, sir." He collapsed during the transport, but the temporary facility had no medical staff. Captain Richardson's expression darkened with anger, not at the prisoner, but at the system that had failed to provide proper care. Then Richardson said, 4 days with untreated pneumonia, get him on oxygen immediately, start antibiotics. This boy should have been hospitalized days ago. Private Washington helped lift the young man onto a stretcher, supporting his head with unexpected gentleness. Then Washington said in German to the terrified prisoner, "You are going to receive medical care. The doctors here are very good, you will be safe. Your friends can visit you tomorrow." The boy's eyes focused briefly on Washington's face, searching for reassurance. Finding it there, some of the fear eased. He managed a weak nod before his eyes closed again. The stretcher-bearers moved quickly toward the infirmary, Captain Richardson walking alongside, already calling out orders for treatment. Friedrich found himself disturbed by the scene. It did not align with the framework he had carried for so long. A soldier of color showing compassion to a captured enemy, coordinating seamlessly with a white officer, both focused entirely on preserving a life rather than asserting dominance or hierarchy. The contradictions were accumulating faster than he could explain them away. That evening, Hans approached Friedrich in the barracks. The former schoolteacher had been reading an American newspaper, one of several left in the common area for prisoners who could read English. His face was troubled, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. Then Hans said, "Friedrich, this article discusses production numbers, steel output, aircraft manufacturing, agricultural yields. The figures are staggering. If even half of these numbers are accurate, the industrial capacity alone would make continued resistance impossible." Friedrich took the paper, scanning the columns of statistics. 60,000 aircraft produced in a single year, 10,000 tanks per month, agricultural surplus exported to allies while the domestic population maintained full rations, steel production that dwarfed anything his nation had achieved even in peacetime. The numbers seemed fantastic, propaganda surely, but they aligned with everything he had observed. The abundance of food, the quality of facilities, the sheer waste that Americans seemed able to afford, vehicles that were replaced rather than repaired, equipment that was discarded rather than salvaged. Then Friedrich said, "Numbers on paper prove nothing, Hans. You were a teacher. You know how statistics can be manipulated. These are just claims designed to demoralize us." But Hans shook his head slowly. Then Hans said, "I taught mathematics, Friedrich. These numbers, they connect to everything we see. The guards' equipment, all new. The vehicles, all functional. The food, always plentiful. Even the waste, the way they throw away things we would carefully preserve. This is not propaganda. This is simply their reality. And if these numbers are real, then everything we were told was a lie. Not just exaggeration, Friedrich. Complete lies about American capabilities." Friedrich wanted to argue, to find some flaw in Hans's reasoning, but the evidence surrounded them. Every day brought new proof that American industrial power was exactly as vast as these statistics suggested. The camp itself was a testament to abundance, from the quality of construction to the casual waste in the mess hall. This was a nation that could afford to build excellent facilities for prisoners, while simultaneously fighting across 2 oceans. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement. All prisoners were to assemble in the main yard for an address from the camp commandant. Friedrich joined the formation, standing at attention from habit, despite being a prisoner. Colonel Thomas Harrison, the camp's commanding officer, took position at a small platform. The colonel was 52, a career officer who had spent 3 decades in service. His bearing was professional but not harsh, his expression serious but not unkind. Colonel Harrison spoke clearly, his words translated by Private Washington for those whose English was limited. Then Colonel Harrison said, "You are prisoners of war entitled to treatment under the Geneva Convention. You will be housed, fed, and provided medical care according to international standards. You will work in accordance with international law, and you will be paid for your labor at fair rates. You will not be mistreated, humiliated, or denied your basic dignity as soldiers who fought for your country." The colonel paused, looking across the assembled prisoners. Then Colonel Harrison said, "Many of you come from a system that judges men by ancestry rather than character. Here you will be judged by your conduct. Here, the color of your skin, the place of your birth, your family name. None of that determines your worth. Only your actions define who you are." Friedrich almost laughed at the words, another piece of American hypocrisy. He glanced at the segregated formations of American soldiers, the separate facilities he had observed. But he caught himself. The speech was clearly directed as much at the American soldiers present as at the prisoners. Colonel Harrison was making a statement about camp policy, perhaps even challenging his own nation's practices. The complexity of that statement, the acknowledgement of ideals not yet fully realized, was something Friedrich had never encountered in his own military hierarchy, where questioning was forbidden. Work assignments began the following week. Prisoners were organized into labor details, their tasks ranging from camp maintenance to agricultural work on nearby farms. Friedrich was assigned to a carpentry detail, using his pre-conflict experience as an apprentice furniture maker. His father had insisted he learn a practical trade alongside his education, believing that the ability to work with one's hands was essential dignity. The work was supervised by Corporal Davis, a quiet man from Ohio, who treated the prisoners with firm but fair authority. Private Washington appeared at the carpentry shop on the 3rd day of work, carrying a set of technical manuals. He had been tasked with translating safety procedures and work instructions into German. Friedrich watched as Washington spread the documents across a workbench, comparing the English originals with his German translations, checking every technical term with careful precision. The young soldier had brought a German-English technical dictionary and was cross-referencing specialized vocabulary to ensure accuracy. Corporal Davis reviewed the translations, nodding approval. Then Davis said, "Excellent work, Private. These will make the safety briefings much clearer. The last translator we had used some terms that were technically correct, but not common usage. Your versions are much more practical." Washington gathered the papers, preparing to leave. Friedrich heard himself speak before thinking through the implications. Then Friedrich said in English, "You translate very well. Where did you learn German so thoroughly?" Private Washington turned, showing no surprise at the question. Then Washington said, "Howard University in Washington. Studied languages and literature. Before I enlisted." The answer created another crack in Friedrich's assumptions. a university education, literature. This was not the limited intellectual capacity he had been taught to expect. Howard University was a name Friedrich recognized from his own studies, an institution with academic standing. He found himself unable to immediately respond, his mind struggling to reconcile this information with years of propaganda. Washington waited a moment, then added something unexpected. Then Washington said, "I read Goethe in the original German. Faust particularly. The tragedy of a man who bargains away his soul for knowledge and power, only to find redemption through unexpected love. Perhaps you know it." Friedrich knew it intimately. His mother had read passages to him as a child, her voice bringing life to the poetry. The fact that this American soldier of color could reference specific themes from one of Germany's greatest literary works, could discuss it with the casual confidence of someone who truly understood the text, seemed impossible. Yet here it stood, undeniable. Then Friedrich said carefully, "Yes, I know Faust. My mother loved that work. She used to read it aloud to me before bed when I was young. A brief understanding passed between them, a shared cultural reference that transcended every boundary that was supposed to separate them. For a moment, they were simply two men who loved literature, who had been shaped by the same great works of human creativity." Then Private Washington nodded and left the workshop, his translated manuals tucked under his arm. That night, Friedrich lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Hans was already asleep, but several other prisoners were quietly talking. They discussed letters from home, or rather the lack of letters. The mail system that had promised to connect them with their families seemed to have broken down completely. No one had received anything in weeks. The silence from across the ocean was more frightening than any news could have been. Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann, a pilot who had been captured after his aircraft was brought down over France, spoke from a nearby bunk. His voice carried the hollow quality of a man who had lost hope. Then Klaus said, "My wife was in Dresden with our 2 children. I have heard nothing since February. The city, some of the new prisoners say it was hit very badly in an operation. I do not know if they survived. I do not know if my home still exists." The raw fear in Klaus's voice silenced the barracks. Dresden had indeed been targeted in a massive operation, the scale of destruction reportedly catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods had been leveled, thousands displaced or worse. The uncertainty of not knowing whether loved ones lived or perished was a torture beyond any physical hardship. It ate at the mind, prevented sleep, made every moment an agony of imagination. Friedrich thought of his own family in Munich. His father, too old for military service, managing a small bookshop that probably no longer existed. His sister Anna, who had been working in a munitions factory, exposed to danger every day from possible attacks on industrial targets. His mother, simply trying to survive in a city that was systematically being reduced to rubble. He had received one letter months ago before his capture, written in his mother's careful hand. Nothing since. The silence was unbearable, a weight that pressed down constantly. March arrived, bringing warmer weather to Louisiana and news that filtered through official channels and whispered conversations. The conflict in Europe was collapsing rapidly. Territory was being lost daily. Cities were falling one after another. The industrial heartland was being overrun. Every update made clear that the end was approaching, and it would not be the victory that had been promised for so long. The western territories were being occupied, while eastern forces pushed from the opposite direction. The nation was being crushed between 2 massive military forces, each with resources that dwarfed anything Friedrich's side could muster. The prisoners absorbed this information in different ways. Some retreated into denial, insisting the news was false propaganda designed to break their spirits. Others became depressed, lethargic, spending their days staring at nothing. A few, like Hans, seemed almost relieved that the suffering might finally end, that the terrible conflict that had consumed years of their lives might conclude. Friedrich found himself in a strange mental state, suspended between the ideology he had carried for years and the growing evidence that everything he believed was fundamentally wrong. It was during this period of psychological turbulence that the incident occurred that would transform everything. April 17, 1945. The afternoon work detail was returning from a nearby farm where prisoners had been planting crops. The work had been hard but not cruel, supervised by local farmers who seemed more interested in getting their fields prepared than in demonstrating authority. The truck carrying Friedrich's group was driven by Private Washington, who had recently been assigned additional transport duties due to his reliability and language skills. The road back to camp wound through dense pine forest, a two-lane path rarely traveled by civilian vehicles. Ahead, around a blind curve, a civilian car had broken down. A white family stood beside the vehicle, the father examining the engine with obvious frustration. A woman and two children waited nearby, the younger child, a girl of perhaps 7, crying from fear or exhaustion. The family's situation looked desperate. They were miles from any town. The afternoon was advancing toward evening, and the temperature was beginning to drop. Private Washington slowed the truck, pulling to the side. Friedrich expected him to drive past, to avoid any interaction with civilians. The segregation that governed American society surely extended to such encounters. Instead, Washington stopped completely and stepped out, his movements careful and non-threatening. The white man looked up as Washington approached, his expression immediately hardening with hostility. Then the man said sharply, "We do not need any help from you. Just keep moving." Private Washington stopped several feet away, maintaining careful distance. His posture was deferential, non-threatening, the body language of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous social situations. Then Washington said politely, "I have mechanical training, sir. I might be able to help get you running again." The man's face flushed with anger, his hands clenching into fists. Then the man said, "I told you to move along. I will not have you touching my vehicle. I will not have someone like you near my family. We will wait for proper help." Friedrich watched from the truck bed, fascinated by the exchange. Here was the confirmation he had been looking for. The open expression of the racial hierarchy he had been taught defined American society. The civilians' hostility was absolute, irrational, based solely on Washington's appearance rather than his offered assistance. This was the weakness Friedrich had been told to expect, the divisions that would tear America apart. But Private Washington did not react with anger or even frustration. He simply nodded, accepting the rejection with practiced calm. Then Washington said, "Understood, sir. There is a service station about 6 kilometers back. I can stop there and send help." The woman spoke then, her voice tight with stress and fear. Then the woman said, "Harold, it is getting dark. The children are frightened. Maybe we should accept the help. He seems to know about engines." The man, Harold, turned on her with barely controlled fury. Then Harold said, "I would rather walk 10 miles than accept help from someone like him. We will handle this ourselves. I will not compromise my principles for convenience." Private Washington began walking back to the truck, his shoulders carrying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Friedrich saw something in the soldier's face, not anger or hurt, but a profound fatigue that came from encountering this same wall countless times. It was an expression Friedrich suddenly recognized because he had seen it before, in the faces of people his own nation had persecuted and dehumanized. The realization was deeply uncomfortable, forcing him to see parallels he had always denied. Washington climbed back into the driver's seat, preparing to continue toward camp. He would send help from the service station as promised, maintaining his courtesy even in the face of contempt. But as he released the brake, a sharp crack split the air, loud as a rifle shot. A massive pine tree, weakened by disease and winter storms, its roots undermined by erosion, was falling directly toward the civilian family. What happened next occurred in seconds, but seemed to stretch across endless time, each moment crystallized with absolute clarity. Private Washington threw open the truck door and sprinted toward the family. The father looked up, frozen in shock, his mind unable to process the danger fast enough. The children screamed, their voices high and terrified. Washington reached them as the tree descended, a massive weight of wood and branches that would easily result in severe injury or worse. Washington grabbed the youngest child, the crying girl, and threw her toward her mother with enough force to clear the danger zone. Then he tackled the father, driving both of them away from the tree's path. The older child, a boy of perhaps 10, was still in danger. Washington lunged again, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him clear just as the tree crashed down with earth-shaking impact. The impact was tremendous. Branches shattered, sending wooden shrapnel in every direction. Pine needles exploded into the air in a green cloud. Dust rose in a choking pall. When it settled, the family stood safe on one side of the fallen tree, shaking and terrified but unharmed. Private Washington lay on the other side, partially covered by smaller branches, not moving. Friedrich was already out of the truck, running toward the scene. Other prisoners followed, their training overriding their captive status. They pulled branches away, revealing Washington pinned beneath a section of trunk. The soldier was conscious but clearly injured, his leg trapped at an awkward angle, his face tight with pain. Cuts on his arms showed where branches had torn through his uniform. Then Friedrich shouted in German, "We need to lift this, quickly. Get leverage underneath. Use those branches as levers." The prisoners organized instantly, military discipline asserting itself even in this strange situation. They found branches strong enough to use as levers, positioned themselves around the trunk, and lifted in coordinated effort. Friedrich pulled Washington free as the others strained to hold the weight, their muscles trembling with the effort. The civilian family stood watching, the mother holding both children, tears streaming down her face. The father, Harold, seemed unable to move or speak, his expression shattered. His hands hung at his sides, his mouth working soundlessly. He stared at Private Washington, at the soldier who had just saved his family despite his cruel rejection. Private Washington tried to stand, but collapsed immediately, his injured leg unable to support weight. Friedrich caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. The soldier's breathing was rapid, shallow. Shock was setting in, his body responding to the trauma and pain. Then Friedrich said in English, "Do not move, help is coming, you are going to be fine." He turned to the prisoners, switching to German. Then Friedrich said, "Someone needs to drive the truck back to camp immediately. Get medical assistance. Klaus, you have driven vehicles like this." Lieutenant Klaus volunteered without hesitation, running to the truck and accelerating away, the engine's roar fading into the distance as he pushed the vehicle to its limits. Friedrich removed his jacket, folding it to support Washington's head. The other prisoners formed a protective circle around the injured soldier, preventing the civilian family from approaching. No one spoke to the family. The silence was deliberate, pointed, a judgment more powerful than any words could have been. Private Washington's eyes focused on Friedrich, struggling to maintain consciousness. Then Washington said weakly, "The family, are they safe?" Friedrich felt something break inside himself, all the carefully constructed rationalizations collapsing at once. This soldier, injured while saving people who had rejected his help with contempt, was concerned only with their safety. The morality was so clear, so absolute, that every rationalization Friedrich had constructed collapsed under its weight. Here was humanity in its purest form, selfless action taken not from hope of reward or fear of punishment, but simply because it was right. Then Friedrich said quietly, "They are safe because of you. All of them. Everyone." Washington nodded slightly, a ghost of a smile crossing his pain-tightened face. Then his eyes closed. His breathing remained steady but labored. Friedrich checked his pulse, found it strong despite the shock, and simply waited. The other prisoners maintained their vigil, a group of captured soldiers protecting an American who had just demonstrated a courage and selflessness that transcended every artificial division. The civilian woman tried to approach, her children clinging to her dress. One of the prisoners, a young soldier named Werner, stepped in front of her. He said nothing, simply stood as an impassable barrier. The woman stopped, fresh tears streaming down her face. Then the woman said, "Please, I need to thank him. We need to tell him we are sorry." Werner looked at Friedrich, who shook his head. Then Friedrich said in English to the woman, "He needs to rest. You can thank him later if he recovers. For now, give him space." 20 minutes later, that felt like hours. The truck returned with a military ambulance following close behind. Medical personnel jumped out, immediately attending to Washington. A white lieutenant, the camp's assistant medical officer named Thompson, assessed the injuries with practiced efficiency, his hands moving quickly but gently. Then Lieutenant Thompson said, "Compound fracture of the left tibia, possible internal injuries. We need to transport him immediately. Get him stabilized for transport. Start a saline line." As the medics loaded Washington onto a stretcher, Sergeant Cole arrived in another vehicle, dust rising from his tires. He surveyed the scene in one comprehensive glance, saw the fallen tree, the civilian family, the prisoners standing guard over his injured soldier. Understanding crossed his face, followed by an expression of profound respect for the prisoners who had helped and protected Washington. Cole walked directly to the civilian man, Harold, who still stood frozen. The sergeant stopped inches away, his presence imposing despite being shorter than the civilian. Then Cole said quietly, but with absolute steel in his voice, "That soldier just saved your family's lives. He did it despite how you treated him. He did it because it was the right thing to do, because he sees the value in every human life, regardless of their treatment of him. I suggest you remember that for the rest of your days." The woman approached Cole, her children clinging to her, all three crying. Then the woman said through tears, "Please tell him we are grateful. Please tell him we are so sorry. Please tell him we will never forget what he did." Cole nodded but said nothing more to the family. He turned to Friedrich and the other prisoners, his expression softening. Then Cole said, "Thank you for helping him. Thank you for staying with him. I will not forget this. None of us will." The ambulance departed, carrying Private Washington to the camp hospital, its siren wailing through the forest. Friedrich and the others were loaded back into a replacement transport. As they drove away, Friedrich looked back at the civilian family, still standing beside their broken car and the massive fallen tree. The father had finally moved. He was on his knees in the dust, his face in his hands, his body shaking with sobs. The weight of his own hatred, confronted by absolute selflessness, had broken something in him. That night, the camp was subdued. Word had spread about the incident with remarkable speed. American soldiers of all backgrounds gathered in quiet groups, discussing what had happened. Some spoke with anger about the civilians' treatment of Washington. Others talked about the courage required to save people who despised you. The German prisoners also talked among themselves, but the usual evening conversations were replaced by something more thoughtful, more introspective. Hans sat beside Friedrich in the barracks. Then Hans said, "You saved his life today. You organized the rescue, pulled him free." Friedrich shook his head. Then Friedrich said, "He saved that family first. All I did was help pull him free from the consequences of his own courage. His action was the remarkable thing. Mine was simply human decency, the minimum required of any person." Hans was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then Hans said, "I have been thinking about something for weeks now, Friedrich. We were taught that some people were inferior, that their lives mattered less, that certain characteristics determined human worth. But I have seen nothing here that supports that teaching. I have seen only evidence that we were lied to about everything that truly matters. Every assumption I was taught has proven false." Friedrich could not argue. The day's events had demolished the last foundations of his ideological certainty. He had seen absolute moral clarity in action. Private Washington had not acted from hatred, fear, or even duty. He had acted from simple human decency, from an instinct to protect life, regardless of how that life had treated him. It was a kind of courage that Friedrich had never encountered in all his military service, a strength that had nothing to do with physical power or weapons. Then Friedrich said slowly, "I think we were not just lied to, Hans. I think we lied to ourselves. We wanted to believe we were superior, that our struggles were noble, that our cause was just. It was easier than facing the truth, easier than accepting that we had been following lies, committing atrocities, destroying lives for nothing. But today I saw what true strength looks like. It looks like a man saving people who hate him, because saving lives is simply the right thing to do." The following days were difficult. Private Washington remained in the hospital, his injuries serious enough to require surgery and extended recovery. The compound fracture had to be set properly, the internal bleeding addressed. Friedrich requested and received permission to visit, a request that apparently surprised the camp administration, but was ultimately granted under escort. Colonel Harrison himself approved it, perhaps recognizing that something important had shifted. The hospital was a clean, well-equipped facility on the campgrounds. Friedrich was led to a ward where several patients recovered from various injuries and illnesses. Private Washington occupied a bed near the window. His injured leg elevated and immobilized, in a cast that extended from ankle to hip. He looked tired but alert, his eyes clear despite the obvious pain he must be experiencing. Friedrich approached slowly, uncertain of his reception. Then Friedrich said, "Private Washington, I wanted to see how you were recovering." Washington studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust this German officer. Then Washington said, "The doctors say I will heal completely. 3 months of recovery, but full function should return. They did surgery yesterday to set the bone properly." Friedrich nodded, relieved. Then Friedrich said, "I also wanted to say thank you for what you did. You saved that family despite how they treated you. That was extraordinary courage." Washington's expression remained neutral, neither accepting the praise nor dismissing it. Then Washington said, "They were in danger. That is all that mattered. When you see someone in danger, you act. That is what decent people do." Friedrich pulled a chair closer, sitting at Washington's bedside. He needed to say things that were difficult to articulate. Then Friedrich said, "May I speak honestly with you?" Washington gestured permission with his free hand. Then Friedrich said carefully, "I came to this camp believing I understood how your society worked. I had been taught that racial divisions were your fatal weakness, that they proved certain people were naturally inferior. That hierarchy was natural and necessary. I watched for evidence to confirm this belief. Every day I catalogued signs of separation, of inequality, telling myself that these proved what I had been taught." Washington listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. Then Friedrich continued, "But everything I observed contradicted what I expected to see. Your competence, your education, your character, none of it fit the framework I carried. And then you risked your life for people who had shown you only contempt. That action destroyed every remaining assumption I held. It forced me to see that the problem was not with you or with American society's treatment of you. The problem was with everything I had been taught, with the entire system of thought I had accepted." Washington was quiet for a moment, then spoke with careful precision. Then Washington said, "I am not going to tell you that this nation is perfect or that the divisions you observed are not real. They are very real. I face them every day. Every single day I encounter people who judge me by my appearance rather than my character, who assume I am less capable, less educated, less human. But I refuse to let other people's prejudices define my actions. I refuse to become what they claim I am. My humanity is not conditional on their recognition. My dignity does not depend on their respect." The clarity of that statement, the philosophical strength underlying it, struck Friedrich with profound force. This was not naive optimism or passive acceptance. This was conscious moral choice maintained in the face of constant opposition. It was a form of resistance far more powerful than any weapon, a refusal to be diminished by hatred. Then Friedrich said quietly, "Where I come from, we were taught to blame others for our problems, to hate those who were different. It made us feel strong, superior, but it was a lie that led to terrible consequences. You have shown me something I never expected to learn from an enemy soldier. You have shown me what real strength looks like. Real strength is maintaining your principles when they are tested, being decent when indecency would be easier, saving lives when you could justifiably walk away." Washington shifted slightly, wincing from pain. Then Washington said, "I am not your enemy, Oberleutnant Weber. I never was. We were made enemies by leaders who needed us to hate each other, who used our blood to pursue their ambitions. But that conflict is ending. What matters now is what kind of men we choose to be when we return home. Will we perpetuate the hatreds that brought us here, or will we build something better?" The conversation continued for another hour. They discussed literature, philosophy, their hopes for the future. Friedrich learned that Washington planned to return to university after his service to pursue teaching. He wanted to educate the next generation, to help young people understand the value of every human life, to prevent the hatreds that led to conflict. Washington learned that Friedrich hoped to rebuild his father's bookshop if it still stood, to create a place where ideas could be shared freely, where literature from all nations could help people understand each other. When Friedrich finally left the hospital, he carried with him a transformation that he knew was permanent. The person he had been when he arrived at Camp Ruston no longer existed. In its place was someone who had to completely rebuild his understanding of human worth and dignity, someone who had been given an undeserved gift of revelation. May 8th, 1945. The conflict in Europe officially ended. In Camp Ruston, the news was met with mixed emotions: relief that the suffering was over, that the terrible years of destruction had finally concluded; grief for all that had been lost, for the millions who would never return home; uncertainty about what would come next, about what waited in the ruins of their homeland. Friedrich and the other prisoners gathered for an announcement from Colonel Harrison. The commandant's expression was grave but not unkind. He understood that this day marked both liberation and mourning for the men before him. Then Colonel Harrison said, "The conflict has concluded. You will remain here until repatriation arrangements are finalized. For many of you, returning home will mean facing difficult conditions. Your cities have been damaged, your economy destroyed. The rebuilding will be long and hard. Many of you will find that everything you knew has changed beyond recognition." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Then Colonel Harrison said, "You have been exposed to different ideas during your time here. You have seen how people of different backgrounds can work together, can treat each other with respect. You have witnessed that human worth is not determined by ancestry or appearance, but by character and actions. I hope you will carry those observations with you. Your nation will need men who can build rather than destroy, who can unite rather than divide. The future of your country depends on whether you choose to perpetuate the hatreds of the past or build something better." The speech concluded, and prisoners dispersed to their barracks. Friedrich found Private Washington waiting near the carpentry shop. The soldier was still using crutches, but his recovery was progressing well. The cast had been reduced to allow more mobility, and his face showed less pain than before. Then Washington said, "I heard you will be among the first groups repatriated, probably within the month. The Western zones are prioritizing prisoners with families there." Friedrich nodded. Then Friedrich said, "Yes, they are prioritizing those with families in the Western zones. My mother and sister are in Munich. I received word yesterday that they survived. Their apartment was damaged, but not destroyed." Washington extended his hand. Then Washington said, "I wish you well, Oberleutnant. I hope you find them safe and that you can begin rebuilding. I hope you will use what you learned here." Friedrich shook the offered hand firmly, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. Then Friedrich said, "I will never forget what you did, not just saving that family, but showing me through your actions what true character means. I intend to live the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that lesson. I intend to build something that honors what you taught me." Washington smiled slightly. Then Washington said, "Just treat people with dignity regardless of their background. That is all any of us can do. Recognize humanity wherever you find it and refuse to participate in systems that deny it." They parted, each returning to their separate duties. But the connection forged between them would prove to be lasting, maintained through letters and eventually reunion. June 23, 1945. Friedrich stood with 40 other prisoners being processed for return transport. They had been given new clothing, medical clearance, and documentation. The journey home would be long, traveling first to a processing center on the East Coast, then by ship to Europe, finally to a distribution point where they would be sorted by destination. As the trucks prepared to depart, Sergeant Cole approached Friedrich. Then Cole said, "Private Washington asked me to give you something. He wanted you to have this before you left." He handed Friedrich a book, a worn copy of Faust in German, its cover soft with use. Inside the front cover, Washington had written a brief inscription in careful script. "To Friedrich Weber, may you find redemption through unexpected friendship, as Faust found redemption through unexpected love. With respect, James Washington." Friedrich felt tears in his eyes for the first time since his capture. He carefully placed the book in his pack, knowing it would be among his most treasured possessions for the rest of his life. The return to Germany was as difficult as Colonel Harrison had warned. The journey took weeks, traveling through a landscape that bore scars from years of conflict. Munich had been heavily damaged. Friedrich's family bookshop was gone, destroyed in a bombing operation that had leveled the entire block. But his mother and sister had survived, living in a partially damaged apartment, struggling with severe shortages of food and fuel. His mother wept when she saw him, holding him as if afraid he might disappear. His sister looked older, hardened by years of factory work and privation, but they were alive, and that was more than many families could say. Friedrich threw himself into reconstruction. He found work with the occupation authorities, translating documents and helping facilitate communication between American administrators and German civilians. His language skills and understanding of both cultures made him valuable. But more than that, he made a conscious decision to challenge every instance of prejudice he encountered. When he heard Germans repeating the old hateful propaganda, he told them about Private James Washington, about a soldier who had risked his life for people who despised him, about courage that transcended every artificial division. Some listeners dismissed his stories as American propaganda. Others, particularly younger people hungry for a different kind of future, listened with attention and asked questions. In 1948, through careful saving and help from American Reconstruction programs, Friedrich managed to reopen his father's bookshop in a new location. He specialized in works that promoted understanding between cultures, books that challenged prejudice rather than reinforcing it. The shop became a gathering place for students and intellectuals who wanted to build a better nation than the one that had fallen. He wrote to Private Washington regularly, letters that crossed the Atlantic, carrying news of Germany's slow recovery and Friedrich's efforts to honor the lessons he had learned. Washington wrote back, describing his return to university, his work toward a teaching degree, his determination to educate the next generation about dignity and human rights. In 1952, Friedrich received a letter with surprising news. Private James Washington, now Professor James Washington, had been invited to speak at the University of Munich about American literature. Would Friedrich be willing to help arrange the visit? Friedrich spent weeks organizing the event, ensuring Washington would receive the reception he deserved. When the former soldier arrived in September of that year, Friedrich met him at the railway station. 7 years had passed since they had last seen each other. Both men had aged, carried new experiences, faced new challenges, but the recognition was immediate and complete. They embraced as old friends, as men who had found unexpected connection across impossible divides. Friedrich escorted Washington through the city, showing him both the destruction that remained and the new construction rising from the rubble. Buildings were being rebuilt, infrastructure restored, life returning to streets that had been silent ruins. Washington's lectures at the university were powerful, attended by hundreds of students eager to hear American perspectives on literature and culture. But the most meaningful moment came when Friedrich arranged a small private gathering at his bookshop. A dozen carefully selected individuals attended, people who had also experienced transformation during or after the conflict, who wanted to build a different kind of future. Washington spoke to them about forgiveness, about the necessity of confronting past wrongs while moving forward, about the individual responsibility each person carried to create justice. At the end of the evening, one young student asked Washington a direct question. Then the student said, "How were you able to save that family after they treated you so badly? How did you find the strength to risk your life for people who hated you?" Washington considered the question carefully before answering. Then Washington said, "I did not do it for them. I did it for myself, for who I wanted to be regardless of their hatred. We cannot control how others treat us, but we can always control how we respond. That is where our true power lies. That is where our humanity proves itself. Every moment we face a choice about who we will be. Those people's hatred was their choice. My response was mine." The words resonated through the room, creating a silence that felt sacred. Friedrich saw tears on several faces, understanding that these ideas, simple but profound, offered a path forward that their broken nation desperately needed. Private James Washington returned to the United States after 2 weeks in Germany. He went on to a distinguished career as a professor of literature and civil rights activist. His experiences during the conflict informing his lifelong work for justice and equality. He rarely spoke publicly about the incident with the falling tree, considering it simply one moment in a life dedicated to service. But in private moments with students who sought his guidance, he would sometimes tell the story as an example of how humanity could triumph over hatred. Friedrich Weber continued operating his bookshop for 35 years, until his passing in 1983. Throughout those decades, he remained a tireless advocate for human dignity, speaking at schools and community centers about the dangers of prejudice and the transformative power of unexpected kindness. He never forgot the lesson learned from an American soldier in a Louisiana prison camp, that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in maintaining one's own humanity regardless of circumstance. The bookshop Friedrich built still operates today, now run by his granddaughter. On the wall behind the counter hangs a photograph from 1952 showing two men standing together in front of shelves filled with books. One is a German former officer in civilian clothes. The other is an African-American professor in a suit. Both are smiling, their friendship evident in their posture and expressions. Below the photograph is a small plaque with a quote from Goethe's Faust, the work that first revealed their shared humanity. He only earns his freedom and his life who takes them every day by storm. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.